The ICF Training and Technical Assistance Team is honored to welcome you to this California Housing and Community Development training session offered through the Emergency Solutions Grant Coronavirus Relief Consulting and Staffing Services contract. I am Chris Pitcher from ICF, and I'll be hosting our session today. Today's training session is part of our racial equity series and is entitled The Impacts of Implicit Bias in the Workplace. I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to our first presenter today, Donald Whitehead. Donald, take us away.
Chris, thank you so much for having us today, and want to introduce ourselves really quickly. Many of you have heard from us a few times as we have conducted this series. I am Donald Whitehead, and I'm one of the co-founders of Racial Equity Partners. Racial Equity Partners is a group of individuals that work together as consultants to work on change through racial equity, and also do racial equity trainings across the country in national organizations, local organizations, for-profit and nonprofit agencies. Also, I'm the executive director of the National Coalition for the Homeless, have been working on homeless issues for 25 plus years, and at pretty much every level of service delivery, and also have worked on racial equity issues throughout that time. And we'll pass it on to my esteemed colleague, Dr. Rajni Shankar Brown. Rajni?
Thank you so much. And I just have to share, Donald doesn't share this often, but you should know he also has an Emmy, and he's quite a fantastic comedian as well. So Donald has many different hats. I am Rajni Shankar Brown. Namaste and welcome. I am the president of the National Coalition for the Homeless Board, and I am also a professor in the Jesse Ball DuPont Chair of Social Justice Education at Stetson University. And I really wear my cap here as an associate of Racial Equity Partners, which Donald helped to found, and it's such a joy to be part of. So I'm excited to be here today and to be in community, especially to talk about such an important topic, one that I think, even as much as you may study and reflect on bias, it's one that we as human beings have to constantly revisit, so that we can reflect and unpack. It's one that has to be ongoing. So really grateful for ICF for making this space, and for everyone who is here on this Thursday joining us for good dialogue and learning. So some engagement and grounding as we get started today. We ask everyone here to please be engaged. Of course, this space is here for you. So, feel free to do what's comfortable for you. If you want to turn your camera on, that's fine. If you want to have it off, that's fine. This space really is for you to get what you need out of it. We ask that you're open and willing to share, listen, and learn. When we have dialogue, it would be really nice if you're able to turn your camera on, or at least your audio, and maybe participate. It looks like, we will have some good space for that. We also have the chat box. Feel free to use the chat. I know that Donald, myself, Chris, and Kristen, we're all going to be monitoring the chat as well. We ask that you don't do individual messages, but just put it to the group, and that way we can really monitor, because sometimes it's hard to kind of do the individual as well. And if there's something we can't answer right now, we'll make sure we do get back to you and we share the resources out. We ask everyone to please speak your truth. This is a space for us all to be collectively together and to share. And, if there's something you would really like us to talk about today, or a specific area or question that would help, in the work that you're doing, feel free to drop that in the chat as well. And we'll make sure that we weave that in or address it as we are sharing our time here today. And then, yes, again, what do you want to walk away with today? And so we wanted to ask the last question on this slide for you to maybe, just drop a moment in the chat. If you want to introduce yourself, please tell us your name, where you work, your community. And if there's something specific you were kind of looking for or hoping for, you can also add that in the chat as well. And again, thank you so much for being here. I see Kristen and Ian have added their stuff in the chat. So we look forward to continue seeing all of you kind of add your information in. So this is our agenda for today. Donald and I are really excited to kind of go through this and to have some good information sharing and dialogue as well. We're going to look at bias, different forms, different impacts. When we talk about implicit bias, this especially is very, very imperative to discussions we may be having in organizations around hiring practices, retention, engagement, creating a healthy culture that is inclusive. And so we're going to try to really link those as we talk today. And also really get a firm understanding around lived experience. So, Donald is our, amazing executive director of the National Coalition for the Homeless, can share a bit more, but, even at the NCH, we are an organization that has always valued lived experience. And today we're really going to talk about the importance of that. And what is lived experience versus learned intelligence or expertise, and why we should be valuing people with lived experience and expertise. We're going to look at ACEs and trauma, cultural competency, recruiting people with lived experience. And we will also add to here to say expertise, right? So kind of a double E. Engaging people with lived experience and expertise, retaining people with lived experience and expertise. We're going to look at some onboarding strategies and promising practices and supports, the importance of bi-directional mentorship, and especially we're going to kind of end today as a collective community, looking at the importance of prioritizing equity and inclusion in the work that we do. And so again, we have a really full agenda. But feel free if there's spaces where you need more, you need us to slow down. We have a good amount of time carved out to be together today. And so we want to make sure that we meet your needs and provide some of the information that you're looking for and you can share back out in your organization. So implicit bias, right? There's lots of different definitions that exist in our world around what implicit bias is. What we know is we can take bias and really categorize it into kind of two predominant areas, explicit bias and implicit bias. Now, of course, we also know that bias doesn't always exist in just these silos. It's often a spectrum and maybe showing up in different spaces and places in different ways, and can even, somebody could even be having both explicit and implicit bias even co-joined. So it's really interesting to kind of unpack this. What we know as human beings is that we all carry bias. We all have bias. Even, those of us who work very hard to dismantle bias, we still have implicit bias, right? And so we know this, psychologists, medical researchers have done a lot of studies really looking at human conditioning. And so we're going to really get a bit more into bias, but Donald and I wanted to stop for a minute and just ask if in the chat, we're going to try to keep this a bit interactive today as well. Can you drop for us, when you hear the words implicit bias, what comes to mind? How do you define implicit bias? I got my chat open here, so I'll try to keep up as you all roll. But, and maybe if it's a new term to you, that's okay as well, right? We're going to really unpack that today. Okay, I see some good stuff coming in here. Thank you all so much. I love the engaged chat. Rebecca says bias that seems logical, right? Animals can't talk. Colleen says unconscious assumptions. Tommy says my actions. Kristen says disadvantage caused by ingrained belief systems. Unconscious bias, Marcel says. Kat says things we've been socialized to learn that can be harmful. Isabel shares favoritism, towards certain groups, prejudice against other groups. Miriam, thank you. Habitual patterns of thinking. Carolyn says, unintentional opinion or perspective, often based in ignorance. And Louise says, implicit bias is the unconscious messaging we've absorbed from early on. Thank you all so much for sharing, right? And I see more of you adding, this is wonderful, right? And so it's interesting, right? Implicit bias is something that is often unconscious. It has been embedded or ingrained. If you think about, we come into the world, birth as a baby, and we start absorbing messages immediately. We are in a world where we are influenced in ways that are both visible and invisible often, or hidden, sometimes where we're not even aware, where we're soaking in different messages that become internalized from family or home, from media, that is a big influencer. And you think about the role of media and how over the course of history, media has really changed, right, and expanded, because now we have the internet. We have media that is kind of available to us, right, with these devices all the time. And we get different messages being kind of put into us, whether it's from marketing or commercials, to visuals that we're seeing, to things that we're reading. School, that is a very big place. And when you think about school, there is a set curriculum, but there's also something called the hidden curriculum, right? Things that are taught, maybe not explicitly, but messaging that is taught that we may pick up on. And so again, every human carries bias, and implicit bias specifically. And what we know about implicit bias is one of the ways to really mitigate and to unpack that and to make sure it does not lead to harm on another or on people or communities is to, first of all, reflect and be able to recognize it. We have to spend some good time reflecting on our implicit biases so that we can be aware and we can hopefully stop them when they do show up and start playing out in ways, even unintentionally. And explicit bias is more open, right, or visible. And we're going to look at a few examples here as well. And when we think about bias, bias can be attached to numerous intersectional identities we carry as humans. So race, right, and ethnicity are areas. When we think about poverty, the bias people carry, study after study showing, right, biases that people often have because of messaging that is sent out. Gender, sexuality, religion, linguistic bias. There are so many different areas that really kind of intersect. But racial bias is one of the most prominent forms of bias, especially that shows up in the United States. Really, there's so many great books that have come out, especially in the past decade. And if you're looking for some good reading material, right, our colleague and friend Ibram X. Kendi has written some great books. Stamped is one I recommend. How to Be an Anti-Racist is another. There's a bunch of good books that have come out. Another one is Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste, The Discontent of Our Origins. And in there, she talks about a caste system that operates in the US, and there are connections here with racial bias. So here are some examples, right? So explicit bias, first of all, is expressed directly, right? That is where bias is just right in the open. And it's you may have experienced it yourself, or you may have been witness when explicit bias has been played out. There's harm that is really connected to this. Bias can also weave into discrimination, forms of discrimination, and there can be a lot of trauma, right, when you experience bias as well on that side. Now, explicit bias, you are aware of the bias. It operates consciously. You know you have this bias and you are acting on it, right? It is very, very situated in this deep awareness or consciousness. An example of explicit bias would be if you see a sign in the window of an apartment building that says, "We don't rent to," you can fill in, right? They are a racial or ethnic category. Lots of forms of open explicit bias not too long ago in our nation, where we had many signs like this, right? On storefront windows. We don't sell to Black individuals. We don't sell to Indians, right? Or indigenous individuals. We don't sell to, Asians, even current day, right? We don't sell to LGBTQ. These are all forms, active forms of explicit bias. And there's many examples, right? We could kind of unpack in terms of explicit bias, which is, really, again, quite, really what's interesting is explicit bias even shows up in our national, kinds of formats and state formats, even within policies, right? And practices and structures sometimes. And that's where you start to see people kind of pushing back in ways. So explicit bias, I live in Florida. And there's been a lot of legislation, right, where
Okay. I think we are having a little bit of a problem with Rajni's sound. Can people still hear Rajni?
No.
No, we cannot.
Okay. Someone said it's solar flares, but so Rajni was explaining implicit and explicit bias and how it shows up today in different ways. And we know that it can show up in our workplaces. It can show up in some of those policies that we have at the government level, and our bias also shows up in our direct relationships with people who we serve in our communities. It looks like Rajni's back now. Rajni, are you okay to go forward? Okay, I see Rajni's picture, but don't see her don't hear her voice. So just again, the explicit and implicit
can you hear me,
bias.
Donald?
We can hear you now.
Okay.
Okay.
Awesome.
I
I'm
just
sorry about
jumped
that.
back
We have a storm here in Florida, one of our many afternoon storms. And so I'm so glad Donald was able to pick in. Hopefully we don't lose Wi-Fi here. But thank you. But yeah, so as Donald was saying, implicit bias, right, is often, unconscious bias, right? So an example, we have many examples of this. You see the example here in the written text. I'll give you another example of implicit bias, where often even, it's interesting, we're starting a new semester at the university, and I had, two of my Black students who are male, shared with me, they said, it's really interesting. We were talking about different kinds of things, including bias today. And they said, just yesterday, we were walking on the sidewalk downtown, and we're kind of in a university, like a little town is real close, the downtown area. And they said, and when we're walking, we noticed the white people would completely move away and go to the other end of the sidewalk, or even go to the other side of the street to go on that sidewalk and then come back over when they were away from us. And they were just saying, we noticed this. What is this about, right? And we had to really unpack that. And one of the other students who is white, she said, after she took a class last semester and we talked about bias, she said, I started realizing I do that sometimes when I see a Black male, and I'm horrified, because she's like, I'm not, I don't think of myself as discriminatory or having bias, but I do that unconsciously sometimes. And so we talk about, where does that messaging come through, and how does that sometimes show up? And one of the ways we can mitigate, right, and address implicit bias is we have to be aware of it. So for the one white student now, she said, I'm more aware of it. So when my body starts to I have this internal message or record playing that tells me to move or go to another side, I realize that's absurd, right? Why am I getting that messaging? And I now stay in that lane. But you have to be aware of that bias in order to tap.
Okay. Looks like we may have lost Rajni again.
Donald, why don't I go ahead and share the slides? Would that be helpful?
Yes, and
That way,
I
when she
actually was
comes
going to do
back,
that.
yeah, I was gonna say
Yeah,
that
why
way
don't
when
we
she comes back.
share the slides in advance to the next one if we
Okay, give
if
me
you don't
just
mind?
1 second to get on the right one. This should help her bandwidth hopefully as well.
Yes, I was thinking that, and I had actually pulled them up. We are on the same page. So just to kind of go back into how the implicit bias may show up. It's the person who locks their door when somebody's crossing the street, or a person who doesn't get on the elevator because the people on the elevator don't look like them. Those are other ways that that bias shows up, but it shows up in our work with people experiencing homelessness. And since we are focused on the experiences of people that experience homelessness, sometimes it shows up in when people come to our door, we have an expectation, and sometimes it's racial bias, sometimes it's just bias. In other ways, we sometimes kind of place bets unconsciously on if that person is going to make it through our system. And sometimes that's based on the way they look. Sometimes it's based on the way they talk. There are all these biases that we unconsciously bring to this situation that may affect how we work with that person. And it also affects us when we're thinking about who we bring in from an employment standpoint. So first impressions, also, these are some types of biases in hiring. So first impressions, the tendency of an interviewer to make snap judgments about a job candidate within seconds of meeting them. And that may be how they come dressed to an interview, or what school they come from, or what neighborhood. You may recognize an address, and that may lead to some bias about who they are. One of the remedies to this that we talk about a lot is blind interviews. I used to, and I talk about this very openly, I used to have a bias in my hiring around the Ivy League schools. So if you went to an Ivy League school and I was doing interviewing, sometimes I would actually that elevate that resume above others before I looked at other things. And then I recognized that I was doing that. There's also the affinity bias, the tendency to want to work with someone who is like us culturally, someone we like, or someone we can socialize with. So in the course of the conversation, we may hear that this person went to a school, or they're a Cincinnati Bengal fan, or something like that. And that bias may come into play. It's an unconscious, implicit bias, but it is a bias. We may have that experience bias that comes in. There's the stereotype bias that we use sometimes in interviewing because we think of people in a certain way, or we have had, we may have seen a news flash about one person in that category, and we tend to judge everybody in that category based on whatever that stereotype may be. Then there's the contrast bias. And I'll turn it back over to Rajni because she's joined us again. Rajni, I'm just into the biases in hiring, and I've only gotten down to contrast. So you can jump back in if you like.
Okay, thank you so much. And I'm hoping my Wi-Fi is good now. The storm is kind of passing, so thank you all for the grace. Yeah, so there's different forms of bias as you see here, right? One of the things we want folks to kind of realize with bias is we've been able to do an incredible amount of science and really study how bias operates in workplaces. And so, thinking about bias and how it operates and what that means in terms of outcomes, specifically in terms of equity, there's a lot of different connections for us to really think of. Interestingly enough, they've done incredible amount of studies that they've replicated over and over again around name bias. So that you'll see under 7 unexpected biases in hiring, name bias is the first one here that's listed. What they've done is they've done these studies where they've taken resumes. Every single thing on the resume is the exact same in terms of credentials, in terms of work experience. The only difference is the name. And they've taken a name that is a white sounding name, and then they've taken a name that is a name of a racial or ethnic individual that is more associated with a different race or ethnicity. So maybe a Black name. In cases they've done Asian names, indigenous names, right? To see how does that affect. Again, everything else on the resume has been the same. What they found is very often the large percentage of times the white name was called back for an interview, immediately got a good response. The person with, who was diverse, racially or ethnically diverse in terms of name, was not called back, right? And this happened over and over and over again as they did these studies across the landscape of the US. And it really started to, lead to some critical questions around bias, right? Why is it we have these resumes that are exactly the same? Why is it that the white name, right, is being called back, but the other person is not? They replicated these studies as well on different fronts. So in fact, in universities, what they did is they emailed a variety of faculty members across the US at different institutions, and they would send the same exact email asking for information about a specific academic program. And one of those emails would be sent, and the name would be a white name. In one particular study, they used a lot of Asian students and they used Asian names. Another study, they used Black names. Again, the white sounding names with the emails received overwhelmingly prompt responses, where often those with racial and ethnic diversity names did not receive any response at all, or received a far later and much less engaged response, then showing how bias really operates and plays out, right? And so this is really, it's pretty distressing to think about, but it also gives us, especially in spaces like this, hope that we can start to have dialogue around this, understand biases, tackle biases, so that we can really work together to advance equity and justice. Job description bias. We have to be very careful when we're writing job descriptions. Is bias showing up, right? If one of our, strategic MAP commitments is being an inclusive organization, then we really want to make sure that in our job descriptions, we are being inclusive. We are being inclusive with language. We are understanding different cultures, right? And not operating perhaps from just our set of lens or one cultural norm. And so we see job description bias happens a lot. And this is another area to kind of tackle. Biased interview questions, predecessor bias, experience bias, just like me bias. So this is interesting. Just like me bias is what you also can call affinity bias. And what they found is often, if you think about humans, this goes back to even if you go into schools, often schools, you'll see that within schools, there's a lot of cliques, right? Students kind of meet other students that are like them and hang out and end up in cliques. And as human beings, sometimes, right, we kind of identify with certain individuals that are similar to us, and that makes us comfortable. And so what happens is that can influence, right, where we are experiencing and marking perhaps higher ratings for somebody in that level of comfort, where somebody else may be diverse and have incredible skill sets, and we may not be fairly giving that opportunity to that person because of affinity bias. Or often called just like me bias, right? And intuition bias. And so these are just different forms of bias. Again, thinking about examples of explicit versus implicit. Explicit bias, right, is women who are mothers are not serious about their researchers. And this is one I just got to share as a professor. I have heard myself many times where, if you're a mother, you're not serious about your career as a scholar, right, or as a researcher. Explicit bias, right, against women, against mothers. Implicit bias, not promoting women with families or not inviting them on research collaborations. So it may not be, you may not even be aware of it, right? Where often maybe you're sitting around, you're in a board and you look around and you say, wow, there's not a lot of women, or wow, we don't have a lot of Black or brown people represented here at all, right? And people may not even be aware until somebody points that out, right? And breaks that bias down. So I see a good question here. Rebecca asks, can you give an example of job description bias? So absolutely. So interestingly enough, I got to be part of a project recently, which was really interesting. NCH has been working with HUD on some various projects. And one of the things we got to do is we got to look at different job descriptions and look for bias that may be in descriptions and rewrite these descriptions to be more inclusive with people with lived experience of homelessness. And so one of the things we noticed is if part of our commitment is to say, we're not going to have bias, right? To stop somebody, we want to be inclusive and include people with lived experience. We have to understand that people who are unhoused, people who are living in poverty, may have additional challenges, right, that are systematically put in place. And all of us here in this space, we know of so many challenges like that that are systematically there that could create hardship, right? And so we come back to the job description, right? And we have to look at, okay, what may be helpful here in terms of maybe, with transportation. Maybe there was, we didn't think about in the job description having a clause in there to say that, there are transportation supports available if needed. That's one example, right? I see Kat put in a cool gender bias checking tool for job descriptions. Another thing is thinking about different abilities, thinking about race and ethnicity, right? And are we being inclusive in terms of even our language when we are writing, right? So, and thinking about gender. So here's the thing, I look at a lot of job descriptions every day, even when I'm helping to help students get jobs, right? We're looking at them. Many job descriptions are written from a gender binary where they just have he, she. But what we know, right, is we have many types of genders on a spectrum, right? And so when you think about gender diversity, we have folks who are non-binary, folks who may be trans, folks who are maybe in tribal nations that are two-spirit. So thinking about even our language within descriptions is another way we can start to promote inclusivity, right? And it takes a bit of educating ourselves, educating our communities. It takes a little more work where we have to roll up our sleeves and dive in and do closer reads. But the outcomes can be really, really powerful, right? It can help to promote equitable practices and ways. But B, it can create a more inclusive description for someone who you want to create bridges to come in, hopefully. So Rebecca, I don't know if that gives you some examples. I do have some others too, and I'm happy to email as well if you want to kind of see even some of the examples of where we kind of rewrote job descriptions. I don't know if that would be helpful. You're welcome. Great question, by the way. So, you can see again, the benefits of tackling unconscious bias are many, right? We can attract diverse talent. We can lead to fairer decision-making processes. We can encourage creativity and innovation, improve employee engagement, result in higher levels of productivity, and we can even increase company revenue. This comes out of businesses have done numerous studies now, and big reports have come out showing that having more diverse teams has really helped in so many different ways that have had tangible, right? Really tangible results and outcomes, which is pretty cool. All right, Kristen, can you do the next slide, please? Thank you. So here we have a quotation first from the extraordinary Bell Hooks. If you're not familiar with Bell Hooks' work, she is truly such a light in our world who passed not too long ago, but her spirit still guides in so many ways. And Bell Hooks says to be truly visionary, we have to root our imagination in our concrete reality while simultaneously imagining possibilities beyond reality. Right? And we have many definitions of lived expertise. HUD and USICH, is doing some great work. And they talk about lived expertise is not new, but the importance of it is finally being recognized in the housing field. Engaging people with lived expertise is an urgent and necessary matter as communities grapple with how to create more equitable systems. What we know is one of the major forms of biases, has been against people experiencing homelessness for a very long time historically within organizations and jobs. And it takes collective action to really change that. Next slide, please. Thank you, Kristen. So lived experience, and Donald's really going to go into this a little bit more in a minute, but I'll give you the context here. It's personal knowledge about the world gained through direct firsthand involvement in everyday events, rather than through representations constructed by other people, right? So an example here is historically, if you look at even HUD at the federal level, right? Many times, policies that directly impact people who are unhoused or experiencing homelessness were made by people who never had experienced homelessness. Now, thankfully, that is starting to change and we have more collaborative pathways growing. I really thank Donald and NCH also for helping to kind of push that in some ways. But we're starting to have more opportunities where people with lived experience are being not only brought to tables, but listened to. And this is really important in terms of decision-making processes and coming up with sustainable solutions. Another way to look at this is experiences of people on whom a social issue or combination of issues has had direct impact. And you can see some references below if you want to check them out. And Jennifer Tardy also does a lot around this work, and we can share some more resources if you'd like. Next slide, and I'm going to pass the mic over well, actually, I think I have one more slide, Donald, sorry. I'll be quick because I know we're a little behind time, although we built in a lot of discussion, so I think we'll be okay. These are ACEs. So if you're not familiar with ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, so much research is being done on this now. And what we know, we put this in here very intentionally, because what we know is folks with ACEs often have higher trauma, but also often experience higher discrimination and experience higher biases against them later in life based on systemic oppressions. And ACEs, it's interesting if you look at generational, and somebody earlier brought up, even when we asked for a definition of implicit bias, generational bias, right? How it's passed down often. The same thing can happen with trauma, right? And we know that with higher ACEs, we actually can lead all the way up to early death, right? So adverse childhood experiences are really strong on this, but also we know that often biases really start to show up because of privileges and oppressions and how they exist in our society. So we know that ACEs, people can have neurodevelopment, cognitive, social, emotional, physical hardships or challenges. And often we have many spaces where biases and stigma still exist. And this is where we all have to work to really dismantle that. Next slide, and I am going to turn it over to the fabulous Donald.
Thank you for the intro, and thank you for all of that really incredible information. So we wanted to touch on just one more bias that in the workplace, as we talk about bias in job descriptions and in the hiring process, we often represent the need of a position. So there are some positions that in our job descriptions, we ask for advanced degrees, which if we really examine the position and the needs of the position, that isn't actually the case. So I'll give you an example now. I'm not in any way talking down about the importance of any particular position, but for an outreach position, it probably does not require a PhD or an advanced degree. You could certainly use lived experience as part of the job description for someone in that position. And I just use that as an example. But for many positions along our continuum, and I know sometimes there is a need based on the regulations that are signed by a particular administration, like the VA has some really strong regulations around where positions are when it comes to education, but there are other positions that we certainly don't have that kind of limitation on. So often we will over qualify a position, which creates a bias for people who have been marginalized when it comes to the acquisition and ability to access education. So that's another example that we see sometimes. But getting back to people with lived experience, we want to just talk about some of the numerous benefits that you will gain when you incorporate a process that allows people with lived experience to be a part of your population, whether it comes from the workforce or an advisory position. So companies and organizations that incorporate people with lived experience are better equipped to make more focused, efficient, integrated, culturally appropriate, and sustainable decisions. Often we have blind spots when we're creating positions, when we're creating programs, and many of those blind spots we can overcome by incorporating lived experience. There's many instances where if we would have asked people experiencing homelessness about a program, we may have come to a different conclusion about a program or a process within our agency. So those blind spots are overcome by bringing into the conversation people who have to live, breathe, and move through the system. People with lived experience also make an organization better equipped to offer more focused, efficient, integrated, culturally appropriate, and sustainable services as well. So both decisions and services can be impacted by bringing in people who have had that experience. It also creates a more focused, efficient, integrated, culturally appropriate, and sustainable product. So all of those are benefits. So your product in this case is the delivery of services to people who are experiencing homelessness, or you may come up with some sort of product within that population that is more helpful by using people with lived experience. One product that I know about as an example was a tool that allowed people to use their cell phones when they found people experiencing homelessness, and they were able to give those locations to outreach workers. And that example came from people experiencing homelessness. What if we were more quickly able to identify places where there are people experiencing homelessness? That would give us a more efficient way of being able to bring people into the system through outreach. Next slide, please. So we also wanted to make sure, and this goes back to the hiring process, and Jennifer Tardy is another really good example of somebody doing this work very intensely. And Rajni mentioned her. And there's this idea of the lived experience intelligence and lived experience quotient. And so lived experience intelligence is the particular set of knowledge, skills, and abilities that develops out of life events and occurrences in which one has been engaged, ultimately enhancing their insight and perspective. And so again, you can't gain that intelligence by most times you can read about it, you can hear theories about it, but in order to get that true perspective and insight, that experience is what is the leading element of lived experience intelligence, getting that that experience and bringing back to the table what perspective you've developed by that experience. Where lived experience quotient is the extent to which one exercises the knowledge, skills, and ability. So when we talk about lived experience versus lived experience expertise, this is where that's defined at. So in the lived experience intelligence, you have that intelligence, you know about the insights and perspective about that experience. But when you take that experience and you apply it, you take those life events and you apply it and you put it into action, that is where those two differentiate. So some people have gone through the experience, and this is very common in the homeless world. We know that most of the people that go through this experience, they move on. They don't want to be reminded. It's a traumatic experience. They don't want to relive that trauma. So they get as far away from homelessness as possible. But those that use the lived experience quotient are those people that go back into direct service. They're people that and use that as their guide as they're delivering that service, or they go into advocacy. There's certainly not a lot of people that go to that second step and use this to help other people or to help the system by providing that insight and perspective in spaces that can help the greater good and more people experiencing homelessness. So that's how we differentiate between lived experience and lived expertise, because just because you've had the experience doesn't mean you have the expertise. The expertise is when you apply the experience. Next slide, please.
And really quick, Donald, I don't want to interrupt, but somebody had just written to me about the artwork, and I just want to share art can be a really useful tool to actually reflect and unpack our biases. And so I know ICF will send these slides out and share, but you can go revisit and check out some cool artists as well and use that as another tool as you reflect.
And I would just also add that this came up in another workshop I was doing today. Art is a really important element in being able to end people's homelessness. So we often approach the issue through people's deficits or whatever of those ACEs they have actually had to endure in their lives. But when programs can be really, really effective is they use that creative side or whatever skill that a person has to move them through the system. And I can talk more about examples of that, but asset building within the population is a really impactful tool that we definitely don't use enough. And I just wanted to relate it back to the art. But
well, and I love
artists.
Donald, I love that you're saying that, because, you know, there's been all this brain research too, showing how when we tap into creativity, it's actually one of the highest levels of thinking. And that is this, and it's actually correlates with our ability to also recognize bias and to have creative ways to mitigate and to stop bias. So it really is, it's very powerful. And I think the arts, you know, are often some ways for me personally, it's helped me to stay resilient with a lot of trauma in my life. And so that's one way I really personally use art. But I love that Donald brings up kind of how art, you know, really is one of the powerful tools within advocating within homelessness. It certainly is in so many ways, but also can be a tool for bias, right? Really unpacking that.
And I know I went a little bit off schedule there, but I just think it's so important that we introduce that concept into the conversations we're having today. We're going to turn it over to Chris. I know we're ready for popcorn now, so Chris, we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Donald. You kind of set me up for my intermission break. So one of our local artists here who has lived experience created a game called The Game of Second Chances. So I just thought I'd take a moment to show you a little bit of their art. And in this game, it gives you a very interesting scenario that would start a conversation. This scenario is, what other than money would you be willing to exchange today for a place to sleep tonight? I think I could think about that for a long, long time and have a lot of very interesting conversations. So it is very important. This particular artist here in Denver, she is housed now, but did go through a lot of trauma and is quite a great artist, actually, and someone who I really look up to. So art is definitely a great outlet and things we should support. But we are here to go through the rest of this session. So I'm gonna leave that particular topic that Donald brought up and made me really passionate for a moment, and say that we are at our intermission. So we're gonna take a quick 5-minute break because we still have another hour plus of conversation today. So I know it's 11:51 in the Pacific time zone. So let's come back at 11:56. 11:56 in the Pacific time zone, and we will get right back at it. Thanks for being with us.
So thank you so much, Chris, and welcome back, everybody. For some of you, you didn't leave and you got to hear our conversation during the break, but really important, really impactful stuff we talked about. And thank you all again for being here today. And thank you all for staying. So we're going to talk about a few other very important topics. One that is really impactful as we work with people within our systems is cultural competence. And cultural competence requires you not only to start to develop ways to integrate people's integrate people into your system and do it in a way which respects the culture that they come from. One of the requirements of being culturally competent is actually having a clear understanding of your own culture so that you can understand the difference. Cultural competency requires that an organization have a clearly defined, congruent set of values and principles and demonstrates behavior, attitudes, policies, structures, and practices that enable them to work effectively cross-culturally. And again, those are many different things. And it's not just having information that embraces other ethnicities within a population group. It's also not being blind or destructive when it comes to what you're doing within your organization and negative things that would affect not only your workforce, but also the people you serve, and being competent and proficient in that. So making sure that there's welcoming environments, making sure that you recognize and celebrate different religious and cultural practices, and sometimes it also involves things like religious celebrations and understanding, you don't have a meeting on a day that is really a day that is honored and very very cherished by a particular religion. So that is a very, very important issue when it comes to cultural competency. It's having materials available in other languages, and it goes far beyond just some of the most traditional languages that we see in our work. And English and Spanish are often places where we look at making sure we're cultural competent in our materials within our organization, but it's also making sure that we move beyond just those religions and think more broadly about the diversity in our communities. It also has to do with our attitudes when it comes to people from different communities, some of the structures that we have in place. One real interesting and never to be changed element of this is how some of our systems are provided, the services are provided by religious bodies, and how that affects people who may not be in that same body. And if our structures and policies and practices don't embrace other religious beliefs, then we're being completely destructive when it comes to that population. So those are places where within emergency shelter, especially, there are some challenges. It challenges us in many ways, but it challenges us by who can go to the facility, especially in rural communities where only one facility exists. Really thinking about how we can broaden our perspective about how people can enter, what kind of policies we have, and how comfortable and competent it is to the people that would need that service. So we're going to talk a little bit in a large group, if we go to our next slide, about the idea of we're not going to talk about it. We're going to talk about job descriptions right now. Sorry, a little off track there. So we talked a little bit about some of this already. We talked about reshaping job descriptions, and how at times we don't offer a culturally competent atmosphere when it comes to our job descriptions, because we don't think through some of the things that we can do to embrace the entrance into our system of other people. And if you see the cartoon there, it says everybody's a genius, but if you judge a fish by their ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it's stupid. And so what that symbolizes is that we have to value people for what they bring to the table. And sometimes they're going to bring different things to the table. So in order to really help us embrace a more diverse population, sometimes we have to do some of the things we have bulleted here. There has to be a visible commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion. So we have to talk about that in our job description, that we value that as part of a person's makeup, that we value those. We have to, as I mentioned before, start to rethink what our requirements are. Do we need that specific skill or that specific education level to finish or to actually be able to do this particular job, this particular activity within our workforce? Are these requirements really needed? We have to value lived experience and lived expertise. And we talked a little bit about the difference between those two. But one of the things we can do is just put that in our job description. I know in one organization that I directed, when we actually put that language into our job description, the number of people who applied for the positions who had that experience or that expertise just increased demonstrably. So it was just quite a few people, quite a few people that showed up at the application process to really express those issues. And sometimes we certainly didn't ask about it. People volunteered that information. And so it really brought so many new people to the position. The other thing we can talk about here, and I think we talked about it in our hiring process, is our blind resumes. So if we use blind resumes, we never let any of our own personal biases into the space. So let's look at an example of an application.
Really quick, I just wanted to share too the quotation that you see with the cartoon. That is a quote that comes from Albert Einstein, right? Everybody is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing it is stupid, right? And so often I think we have these narrow frames, right, that we have to break. So the application piece, we don't have a ton of time, but we actually were going to open it up to see if anybody wanted to kind of share things that they are doing actively in their organization to rewrite job descriptions or other examples. And I know we talked about some examples earlier with the great question Rebecca had asked. But does anybody have any kind of work that they would like to share or examples?
I would also
Right.
just add
Yeah.
to the conversation that one thing people don't know about that cartoon and that quote is that Albert Einstein was really a really strong presence in making sure that racial equity was in place. I think he would bring people to his house that couldn't get into hotels because of their race. I think that's a part of him people don't know a lot about. So I just wanted to make sure people understand he was really involved in the racial equity movement.
Yeah. And Albert Einstein, Donald, I just was thinking about this too. He had dyslexia and had a lot of challenges. His life is fascinating, actually. Rebecca, I see your hand is up.
Yes, sorry, just took a bite. One of the things that's come up recently in our organization is that there is a tribal woman who was working in a position of project management, and she wasn't successful in that position. And some of the reasons that were given was because she wasn't concrete with her deadlines, and she wasn't driving project completion the way the rest of the organization expected. So we recently talked about bringing her into a different department in a different role and address some of these concerns about her lack of respect. And the question that I have is, are we requiring what's necessary for the job, or are we requiring that it be done in a white, systematic or organizational structure that reflects our preconceived ideas? Is she still being effective, even if she's not being effective in the way that we had previously defined it? And so we have started her in a different role, but it is one of the huge questions I have. Just similarly, we had another applicant, so we're managed Medi-Cal. We had another member or staff member who represented our demographic, our member demographic, patient demographic, but it was literally her first benefited job in her entire life. And so she would show up to work a couple hours late and not tell anybody. But it's like, is she being defiant, or does she just not know that she's expected to communicate with her supervisor if she has a traffic issue or something like that? And so really, it does require a huge amount of rethinking what's essential, what is, and how do you coach people to success, to essential success, not just preferential success.
Mm-hmm. How beautifully, first of all, said, just even in terms of what you just articulated, so much there, Rebecca. But one thing I would say is a lot of times, right? I love one thing that specifically, I'm just reflecting here on what you said. Is she really, is it that she's not successful at her job or successful at meeting whatever those kinds of guidelines are or expectations, right? Which may be operating from a dominant culture of some sort. So sometimes we do have kind of often what we'll say is white dominant norms that operate, right, in policies or practices or structures. And if we're trying to be inclusive, right, we do have to be able to differentiate, right? When is that showing up? But when is it also, where we have a deadline and that's important to the work, right? That has to be moved. And so it takes a bit of unpacking and really kind of cultural reflection there. I think that, relationships, a lot of when we earlier Donald was talking about cultural competence, and with cultural competence, right, even just starting in a place where we're centering our humanity, and relationships have to really be centered there, so we can start to get to understand people that we work with, and people feel comfortable asking questions or opening up or even sharing. And a lot of times there can be a lot of miscommunication or misunderstanding or bias, right, where somebody is coming in late for work, right? And if we have, no trouble with transportation, we haven't experienced what that's like, right? And our life, we have shelter and we are able to just get to our job, it's very easy to kind of fall into the trap of judging somebody who they may be having a lot of hardships or challenges we're not even aware of, right? Just to try to get there to the job. And so that's where getting to know people, right? And sometimes somebody may be uncomfortable coming and sharing that with their supervisor or with their colleague, because we do live in a culture or workplace where often you are immediately punished or dismissed or looked at, you're incompetent, or you're not going to be able to do this job then, and you're going to be let go, right? And maybe they really need the job. And so we have a lot of barriers that are often kind of put in place that prevents us from really operating in a way that is moving towards equity and inclusion. And so I love what you asked, right? And so in terms of your colleague from the tribal nations, one question I would ask is, so if she was not meeting particular deadlines, or perhaps operated in a different time frame, right? There could be a number of reasons for that. And I wonder, was that kind of explored? Was a conversation ever had to kind of understand perhaps where she's coming from? And I wonder what, if you're able to kind of share insight, I'd be curious, right? Was it more that she needed more time to understand whatever in the system or role? Was it because she, culturally, timelines can be more flexible, right? In different cultures where, it's not operating from a kind of a deadline norm,
And Rajni, if I could
Yes.
jump in here, I think one other really important point I want to make here is
Yeah.
that the requirements of the job should be the requirements of the job, right? And so we're not asking people to make special allowances that we're asking, and we're not asking people to make special hires. We're asking people to level the playing field. So the expectations should be incorporated of the job by everybody. So everybody should be able to do the job. But Rebecca made a really important point. Are the expectations of the job equitable in themselves? So, is it a deadline that's really required, or a deadline that we've put in place just because it feels like the way it has been done forever? And so examining those places where that deadline can be adjusted so that it isn't so overwhelming to people that just come into that job. But, the other issue of, should a person report kind of if they're showing up on time or not? I think if you set a standard, people should be able to meet that standard. So if someone is showing up for late for work and not contacting a supervisor, in your job description, if it says you should do that, you should do that. And so we shouldn't make any kind of accommodations. People should be treated fairly. And if we don't treat people fairly, we actually disrupt the idea of dismantling inequitable treatment. So again,
I'd like to make a comment in regards to the biases, kind of give a couple more examples. The biases is not necessarily racial. I had an experience where I was hired as an intern earlier in my career, and childhood friend also was hired by the federal government as an intern also. And he just happened to be heavy set and a dark complexion. The employer's impression of his work skills was different than mine, primarily, I think, because of his weight and because of his complexion. Another example, I have a cousin that had been adopted. His last name is Wu. And when you get interviewed for a position, they have an impression of what he's going to look like. And he would come in through the door, 6'4" with a big afro. And, then there would be a different reaction. And the final example, when we were talking about name biases, I'm thinking of the high school in Orange County. They wanted to name it Martin Luther King, and it was in the Orange County suburb. And the parents reacted to that because they didn't want the school, they thought it was going to hinder their children's opportunity in getting into college because they were having the impression that it was from
HBCU.
No, not necessarily that, but it would be an urban school as opposed to a suburb, and it would reflect the possibility of them getting into a good college.
Tommy, those are fantastic examples you just shared. And earlier, I just wanted to say in the chat box, I put something called the implicit association test, which is a tool. It's not a perfect tool, but it's an interesting one for us to kind of be cognizant and unpack and, start to think about different biases. And you mentioned one being weight, right? Where a colleague was heavier set. And there's a lot of biases with weight that they have found in job where people correlate it to people being more lazy, or people correlate it to all of these things that are not necessarily true at all, right? And so great examples in terms of that with the biases, right, and recognizing them. The darker skin, I mean, there's a workshop actually we did on colorism that if you haven't watched, ICF has the recording. It's quite powerful. You all should kind of look at that maybe too, right? Because there still is a lot there where we're still finding bias exists, and even hair, what you brought up. I can tell you, I've been part of various meetings many times where somebody has been written up, even, some of my former students who are in school administration positions in schools. And, they will say, they're saying that I'm not professional and I don't understand why. Right. And so I'll come in also as an advocate and try to see what's going on. Well, often, they will continue to say that. And in 2 cases, it was because of hair. One of the girls had locks. Another girl wore her hair in a different way, and it had nothing to really do with professionalism when we could unpack it. And the bias kind of finally came out where they brought up, it was about hair. And that was really interesting, right? To say, well, where does that norm come from? Let's talk about that, right? What makes you say that natural hair is unprofessional, right, of somebody's culture? And so there's a lot of forms of biases. I appreciate those examples because they're really powerful. Donald, anything you want to add?
Well, I would add one more bias because if color bias is a subject, you can really think about like the highest levels of success in our country. So in terms of the African-American population, the election of Judge Ketanji Brown was momentous, just an incredible accomplishment. Because if you think about those who've actually made it to the top rungs of society, and the exclusion would be maybe Clarence Thomas. But if you think about Barack Obama or our current vice president, they're all people of mixed race. They're lighter skinned African-American individuals. Thurgood Marshall. I could go on and on about the different levels of colorism that have been involved in the highest levels of our government. Not often do you see someone who's darker skinned African-American make it to that level. And it goes all the way back to slavery, where people that were lighter skin were preferred over people with darker skin. Happens in Latin America and in Central America, all over our world. It also happens in, other parts of the world. Asia is another place where dark versus light happens. So that is a place we got a lot of work to do in our society, but it really shows up at the top levels of society, and people are still treated differently based on how dark their skin is. And we see that all the time.
Yeah.
So
and the bias is global, right?
Yes,
as well.
It is global.
You can look at the skin bleach products that are sold around the world and equated in commercials to success.
$8 billion industry.
Skin, you'll be more successful.
That's an $8 billion industry. So
yeah,
it may be more now. It was about 8 billion a couple of years ago.
Yeah, so the bias is really strong, and you still see it in many areas, right? So even thinking about gender bias, where women are still paid less than men, right, overall per dollar. People who are Black and brown are still paid less for doing the same job. When you look at, what has come out, they did a recent study showing actually Asians in the United States are the least likely to be put into managerial and into leadership roles. So it's very interesting where in corporations and companies, they're often given more responsibilities because they do the job, but not the tangible where they're put into that role, right? And various biases come into that. So we have a long way to go. Yeah, go ahead, Donald.
One last thing I'll say about bias.
Yeah.
Everyone has bias. And I don't know if we said that in our examples, or if we said it in the explanation. it isn't confined to race.
No.
Every one of us goes into situations with bias. Now, sometimes we're aware of it, we control it, we mitigate it. Other times we just use it. So bias is everywhere. So no one gets off the hook when it comes to bias. We all have it. So we'll probably just move on from there, but just want to make that point that everyone has
We
some
do.
bias.
And we started today, right, saying that every single one of us has bias. And it's our job in some ways to reflect and unpack that bias. The other thing is we internalize as well bias. So there's been a lot of studies done where even if we're going to go back to race, again, all the social identities and bias exists. But there's been a lot of studies done that have showed where, they did these doll studies back in the 60s, asking children, who is the smart child, doll, right? Who is smart, who is beautiful? And the white dolls were often picked. Now they've replicated that study even closer to today's time. And it's really, you can see, actually you can Google online and watch a couple of the videos that they've put out there, but even Black children and brown children are picking the white doll as the beautiful one, right? The white doll is the smart one. Where, right, is that bias? That internalized kind of messaging and bias coming in. So there's a lot to kind of unpack. And I was glad, Tommy, again, your example with weight, just thinking about how bias shows up in so many different ways. In interviews, there still is very active forms against certain categories, and ability is another one. We haven't talked about disabilities today, or different abilities as much. But that is a bias that shows up a lot, where people who are neurodiverse or people who may have different physical abilities are often experience bias, even if they can do the job, right, at an excellent level. Trans individuals. You also, another great resource are equal access rule workshops you may want to check out, but we talk about bias and discrimination against LGBTQIA P2 plus individuals. Lots of work to be done. And there's intersections with race, sexuality, gender that we have to be cognizant of as well. Great job. And these are really discussion questions up here for us to collectively discuss. And so, Tommy, you shared great examples now. Rebecca has shared some great examples. Does anybody else have any that they want to share or talk about? Or even any of the questions on the page here that you'd like to kind of share out on? And Chris just put the colorism recording link in our chat box. So some of you have asked and said you're interested in it. And so thank you, Chris, for putting that in. Awesome. Miriam, see your hand up.
Thank you. I'm keeping my camera off for bandwidth reasons.
Sure.
You can't see me, so I'll tell you, I'm white, and we had a candidate in our hiring process who made me uncomfortable in ways I couldn't articulate. So I figured implicit bias and didn't weight it heavily. But then after this was an employee as a colleague, he ended up we ended up having some problems with sexual harassment and needed to ask him to leave. And so this was an example where I did have a visceral, unexplained, intuitive reaction. And
Right.
I can't actually tell the difference between I'm feeling uncomfortable because I have a lot of internalized bias and I'm feeling uncomfortable because I'm picking up on patterns of behavior that I've experienced that do indicate a problem. They both feel the same. Do you have any ideas for ways I can find resources or learn more so that I'm not, so that I can both benefit from intuition, but also not perpetuate existing hierarchies and be reinscribing these biases in the broader world?
What a really insightful question that you ask, and a powerful question, and one that definitely it resonates in different ways as well, right? So even it can be a fine line and kind of blurry sometimes, where we may have intuition or we may have our own past traumas that come up for some reason, and then bias is there, and we're trying to unpack all of that. I think one of the one of the best ways to kind of handle that is to continually practice reflection, right? Which it seems like you are doing an awesome job of. Just as you kind of asked this question, you're obviously in that critical space of trying to reflect and to decipher. One of the things we say, best promising and best practice in terms of interviews, one of the reasons they always say it should be more than one person doing an interview is for these reasons as well, right? And to have a diverse kind of interview panel. So if you're able to have more diversity among the panel, you're able to have multiple people, right? You're going to have different perspectives to come to hopefully counter some of that too. If bias is in fact showing up versus intuition. But intuition is something too that does show up, right? For kind of valid reasons. But at the same time, it can be very blurry, right? Very hard to kind of decipher that. So I appreciate you saying that. And none of this is always perfect, right? It can be a messy process as well. I think some of the best practices in place and being strategic can really help to mitigate, right? So having multiple people, having to go back and having like a rubric can be very, very helpful. So you're having to go back and you're really assessing, right, a person on those skills, on those different things. If you have a gut intuition of some sort, spending some time, often we live in a culture that's just go, 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 and it's so busy, we don't take time to pause and to reflect, but to have to go back and to identify, right? If something made me uncomfortable, you did share, right, at that time you weren't able to quite articulate, but maybe there are times where we can reflect and say, what was it, right? And was it evidential, like something really happened, or am I, and sometimes, you may not know till you hire somebody, right? And you have documented evidences of some sort, but we have to do the best we can to eliminate bias. And so some of those promising practices, I think, can really help. Donald.
Well, I'm sorry. I thought I was
Yeah.
trying to jump in at a space where you were.
Yeah, that's perfect. I was about to turn it over to
I
you.
hope it wasn't too quick.
No.
Don't ever want to talk over anybody. But Miriam, here's the issue.
Yeah.
Here's two things I want you to keep in mind, that we come to our understanding of race through socialization. So that may be from our parents, from the media, from all kinds of different sources, from our school system, from our workplace in this case. The important message that we have to take from this particular issue is that that experience doesn't become your thinking about everybody that looks like that particular individual. So his practices, whatever experience he did down the line, are indicative of that individual. It's not indicative of a whole race of people. So whether he was Black or white or Hispanic or Asian, that is an experience of that one individual. That experience should not be the experience that we hold close to us about that race or ethnicity of people. So taking that and using it as isolation. So great that you were able to have that intuition, but that intuition should not be something that you bring into the next conversation with somebody that looks like that person. So that's where we can interrupt bias. So the next time we're interviewing somebody, we actually see that person as who they are, and we don't bring that other experience into that relationship. So that's why it's important to have a multiple set of ears and eyes. But it's really important that we stop there and we base that particular incident on my relationship, my feelings, my thoughts, my experience with that individual, but not about that race of individuals or that ethnicity of individuals. So that's where we have to make sure that we're always examining our bias.
There's an article out there too, and I think it's intuition, power and perils, or something to that sort. I'll try to find it, and then I'll try to send it maybe to Chris or Kristen to send over to you, or if you drop your email, I'll try to write it down, Miriam. But you might find it interesting. Kind of goes a little bit into that. But yeah, it can be hard. There are some other best practices too. I'll just share. they are suggesting now, before we do an in-person interview, often we kind of hold interviews nowadays, even virtually, but they're saying actually to do a phone interview where it's just a voice before you do an in-person interview, right? So you can listen a little more openly without judgment. That's, and to unpack some of that bias. But I do think it's hard, and intuition is hard, but they've done a lot of studies showing that if you can have strategic ways to make sure that you're capturing data to make the entire process more equitable, that can help to reduce some of those concerns too, right? And you can always talk to somebody openly, right? If you're doing interviews with multiple people, sometimes talking through things in an open reflection, if you have that kind of work culture, can be helpful, right? So an example, if Donald and I are both interviewing and I have that intuition show up or pop up, I want to be careful, though it's not bias. It's talking to a colleague, right? With Donald in a confidential, you obviously, you want to make sure that you're with only the people on the search committee, and making sure that you're unpacking it to avoid bias can be very helpful. There's a lot of tools that I have available that I can share with folks who want to look at some more of these promising practices that have come out of research in terms of bias and job interview processes as well. And I'm happy to share. But again, it's not always a perfect system. So Miriam, just the fact you're asking those questions, though, shows that you are a really deeply reflective person and you're doing some of that critical work. And that's amazing. I think, we all have to do that. Thanks for that question. Anything else? Any other questions? Okay, we're going to kind of keep rolling then. Can we do the next slide? So this goes into what we talked about earlier, right, with names. Just to kind of share, this comes out of research that was done. It was recently replicated and the results have been very similar. White sounding names on resumes, right, are 75% more likely to get an interview request than identical resumes with Asian sounding names. 50% more likely to get an interview request than identical resumes with Black sounding names, 25% more likely to get an interview request than equally qualified resumes with Latinx sounding names, Latina, Latinx sounding names. And so again, this shows kind of bias and how it may operate. And so we want to make sure that we have those factors where we're making sure we're eliminating some of those. And Donald shared a good strategy earlier where there's many programs, in fact, where you can actually have it where it removes the name altogether. And then you can bring the name back after you've kind of did your ratings or rankings. Next slide. Thank you, Kristen. So recruiting, engaging, and retaining. And I think, Donald and I can both share some different best practices and promising practices here. One, we talked earlier about strengths-based lenses, how important that is that we're looking at strengths as opposed to deficits. And it takes practice, right? It takes practice. And there are tools for assets-based and strengths-based lens, building that we can use to help us with that exist out there. Making sure we have inclusive hiring practices. And it's not just personal practice. It actually needs to be systematically built into the workplace organizational culture and practice, right? So making sure that some of these practices we're talking about here are really built in, making sure that we have, diversity on our actual interview committees and teams. And if we don't have that diversity, how can we make, people do innovative things, right? Where sometimes maybe they bring somebody from the community who may be able to also offer a different perspective as part of the hiring team. Lots of different ways to think about that. Avoiding tokenism and isolation. This is really important. It's not just about hiring inclusivity and diversity, thinking about that when hiring. What are we doing after we bring folks on to also make sure our culture is healthy and we are retaining and engaging individuals? It can often be very, very disastrous where we do all this work to bring someone on who's diverse, and then the culture has a lot of different perpetuating mechanisms that perpetuate trauma for the individual, and it's not an inclusive culture. So you have to be working on both fronts. I'm going to pause and let Donald kind of take over there with building a welcoming environment.
Yeah, so building a welcoming environment is incredibly important, and making sure all of the things above happen within your organization. You know, the onboarding process and the culture of the organization are really what's going to be most helpful in retaining your workforce, and it has to absolutely be culturally competent. So making sure that you again look at some of the things that are valued in the culture of the person you bring, but also the welcoming environment. This is not necessarily racially motivated, but it's really about providing the space for people to be able to learn and be able to have that environment that's open with their supervisors. Those kind of things are really important, and it goes to creating an emotionally safe space where people are able to grow, but also throughout the time that they're in that space, they're able to share about a range of things. So creating an environment that people feel open, sharing about some of their challenges as they move into a new workforce, and providing trauma-informed care for all staff is important as well, because we know that there is a secondary trauma that sometimes comes when we're working with our clients, and really making sure that self-care is a part of what we do in our workforce. I can't stress anymore how important it is that because of the nature of our work, that we make sure that people take vacations, and that we encourage people to do things and have a cutoff and prioritization point with their work, so they can be able to, because you can't be your best self with your clients if you're dealing with that trauma and you haven't taken care of yourself personally. So really important that is something that's absolutely actively happening within your agency and organization. We talked a little bit about reimagining traditional bureaucratic norms, and Rajni kind of captured it as sometimes we operate in a white dominant culture, and some of the norms like being perfect, or how we view time, are things that are not always parts of other cultures, but kind of reimagining a space where we have the option to do things a little differently. So maybe it's not using Robert's Rules of Order, or making sure that, you know, there's a place where people with childcare issues have a way to be able to manage those issues, changing the meeting time, a lot of different things. Kyle, ICF is really good about this. Kyle, ICH is really good about this, including breaks in your meetings and not having this continuous avalanche of information and process that sometimes can be debilitating. So making sure that there is a break for people to be able to be able to recenter themselves in some of those really hard conversations. And Rajni will talk a little bit more about bi-directional mentorship.
Yeah,
Did you want to jump back in there?
Oh yeah, I'll jump back in here, Donald, thanks. So the bi-directional mentorship is so key. So let me give you an example of this. Often, you know, we bring somebody who's diverse perhaps, and maybe the organization is not as diverse. So here's an example, right? I, as a brown woman outside of many dominant kinds of narratives, may join a predominantly white institution. And so there may be this good intention of, we need to give Rajni a mentor, right? Because, you know, she is gonna, you know, she's trying to navigate this culture, which can be difficult or different. But here's the thing, right? That mentorship needs to really be bi-directional in some ways. And so it shouldn't just be somebody mentoring me to be able to assimilate into this. If you're saying that you're building an inclusive environment, right, you should also be looking at mentorship from me coming in, or be open to feedback. If I'm noticing perhaps different gaps or disparities or areas that are not inclusive, that are not equitable, right? That mentorship needs to be kind of bi-directional in that way. And there needs to be a certain trust that is built. You know, again, when we are saying that we want to be inclusive and we value diversity and we affirm it in our job descriptions and our hiring, and then we bring folks in and the culture is not, that can be very, very problematic in a number of ways. Another thing I want to point out here really quick, I'm going to add in a bullet here, along with engaging and retaining. We want to think about our evaluation systems too, and make sure that we're avoiding bias in that. That is an area where there's been a lot of research done now showing how people of color, specifically, especially when they are maybe one of a few within an organization, are often held to different standards, higher standards, expected to do more, presumed incompetent. All of these things have come up, right? And so these are areas too where we want to make sure that we are not biased in some sort of way. Even looking at our evaluation instruments becomes important. And that ties in, right, to affirming diversity, cultivating inclusion. And this has to be ongoing. It's not like, you know, in any work environment, we're ever going to say, okay, we are inclusive, our work is done, right? Inclusion is a verb and it has to be ongoing and active, especially going back to understanding that we all carry bias, right? And it operates and shows up. Understanding intersectionality, this is really important. Being able to listen and to listen in layers, right? And being able to slow down and unpack things. Have those difficult conversations. A really good framework that you may want to look at as another strategy for your toolbox within your organization is something called appreciative inquiry, which can really help to unpack bias in some ways and advance equity. And then committing to continuous growth and committing to education. Right? Education has to be a key piece, and there has to be different platforms and opportunities for folks to educate too. You know, individual pathways for education, but collective kind of unified education as well. And we have a saying here, nothing about us without us. And this just goes back to, again, even as we think about recruiting, as we think about engaging practices, retaining practices, we want to have diversity affirmed and part of decision-making processes because that is so imperative, so imperative. Next slide. Compensation. We want to think about, even as we are thinking about bias, an implicit bias, are we analyzing tangibles as well, not just culture, tangibles from a strategic way within our organizations to make sure that biases is not showing up, right? And that we're not exploiting individuals as well. So going back into, we talked about people with lived, Tommy says, yes, Tommy, exactly. We talked about people with lived experience, right? Bringing them in and how important that is. Well, one thing we're noticing is there's a lot of communities and organizations where now they recognize the value, or they recognize there's a need to have people with lived experience and expertise brought in. And so they're bringing people in to get perspectives, but often the people aren't paid, right? And so we need to think about equity as well. That's really important. And thinking about compensation when we look at our organization, are we doing the deeper dive to say, hey, let's take a look at how payment is being, how salaries are being doled out. And let's take a look from different angles, right? So racially, let's look at what we have going on and what are salaries, And are we seeing any disparities? And if there are disparities, right, let's unpack that and make sure that there's not bias or discrimination, right, active forms at work here. Let's look at gender, right? How are women paid? How are men being paid, right? Are we making sure that it's fair? Often there's additional labor and work responsibilities put on to people who are diverse within an organization, especially as we start to say we want to be inclusive. So let me give you another example of that is, so in a predominantly white institution, there may be this recognition that we want to move to a more inclusive environment. So we're going to put together a diversity and equity, diversity, inclusion team, right? And so then we bring people of color because that diversity representation is important. But here's the thing, right? Often people who are already racially, ethnically diverse, or one of the other identities diverse within the organization, already may be doing extra labor and work. And so how are we compensating that? Right. So even at my own institution, a predominantly white institution, I'm often asked, right, as a woman of color, to serve on this, to be part of this committee, to do this, right? But it's not compensated, right? And then people who are in the leadership roles, who happen to be all white males in this instant, right, are often compensated a lot. And even as diversity work is done, maybe celebrated for that work, but who again is doing that work, right? So asking these bigger questions, these critical questions in our organizations becomes really, really important. And I'm just seeing in the comments too, Tommy shares, I'm troubled by patronizing comment that person doesn't understand she needs to come to work on time, or she needs to alert her supervisor of the fact. It's a disservice to treat anyone different. Okay, so yeah, so Tommy, maybe you can turn your mic on too and share a little more with us there, right? If you're comfortable.
I was just going by Marion's comment that
Yeah.
it continues to just gnaw at me, and I just made the comment. I mean, I don't know all the circumstances that were involved. However,
Right.
Everyone knows that they got to come to work, and they got to come to work on time. And if they have trouble getting there, they need to alert their supervisor.
Yeah.
People with lived experience, maybe it takes them some time to get to a work habit. Yes, however, what was being shared sound kind of patronizing to me.
Yeah.
So this is Rebecca, and I'm the one who had shared that example. And I appreciate you mentioning that, Tommy. In this particular case, it's not a chronic situation where this was happening, where it was acceptable or permitted. It was the first time she didn't show up, the supervisor said, "What's she doing? I need to write her up." And it's like, before we move immediately to discipline, we need to make sure she understands the expectations that other people may have understood from day one, but we hadn't made expressly clear. And so, no, she became rapidly compliant with the expectation. She just had never had that expectation before.
And Tommy, that's the point I made in my comments, that sometimes the expectation has not been set. So like who you call when you're late, or, when you need to call, sometimes, that is not explicitly explained. And so a person would not know exactly what to do in that situation. And it's not patronizing in that way. That if you say that nobody of color knows what they're supposed to do, then that's very different than saying, like, in this particular hire. And, sometimes we don't think of everything we need to explain when we bring somebody on. That would seem to be something that everybody would know how to do from another experience, but maybe in this case, it wasn't explained properly. And so they either called the wrong person or they didn't call anybody. You would hope that was something that everybody knew, but there could be an experience with that. The proper procedure for doing that hadn't been explained well enough. And how you alert somebody to a vacation, those are things that, like, if you don't explain them fully, some people will, not exercise the proper procedure for that. So I hope that's what Rebecca was trying to say, and not and I'm not certainly not speaking for Rebecca, but I hope that's what she was about to say. There's another comment about the
Yeah.
$600 rule, and I can talk about that just really briefly. But Tommy,
Yeah.
hopefully, did that get to what you were saying?
Yes, I just didn't, again, I didn't know the complete circumstances that were involved. And I
Yeah.
didn't want them to say, give an excuse just
Right.
because of something. Okay.
Right.
Absolutely. But we
Right.
really appreciate what you did, because that's an example of a courageous conversation. You needed a little more explanation on something, and you had the courage to go ahead and say that. That's the kind of dialogue we want to have in these trainings. Raji, really quick, I'll explain what the $600 rule is. If
Awesome.
we're working with people that are in homeless situations, and there are issues of compensation to them, according to the IRS, if they get more than $600, that has to be reported on their taxes. So we always make sure that people understand that, and that they are certainly letting their clients know that they do have to report that income. So that's the $600 rule. Very simple rule. If you get more than $600, you need to report it to the IRS, and we don't want anybody to get in trouble for not reporting to the IRS.
Yeah, and also I'll just share really quick too, right? Making sure, so even if we're trying to be inclusive, we're trying to help individuals. So in this case, if we're bringing in people with lived experience and we're trying to pay them, it's interesting, in a lot of focus groups we've done, people with lived experience have brought up a lot of good stuff. And they said, in some cases, right, getting money here, I'll have to pay out, and I actually end up in a deficit. It doesn't help me. I end up in a deficit. So
Housing
in order to
costs.
be equitable, yes. So, we have to go back and we have to be equitable and think about, okay, well, we want to help this person, right? They're helping us, bringing perspective into what we need as we're doing different processes. How can we be of benefit and help? And so maybe it's changing what we are, if we have that agency and ability, right? Being able to change that, to say, okay, maybe we can do gift cards. Yes, Alejandra just put gift cards. So maybe it's giving gift cards, right? Maybe it is saying, okay, is there, in some cases a cash app or something that can help you with groceries or different things that you need, right? So it's being flexible even with our payments and allowing somebody to have agency to maybe decide, right, how they want to be compensated or what will best help them be compensated, right? There's no one size fits all, right? Chris is right. And this goes back to a lot of times our systems are structured in kind of this factory model of boop, 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 boop for efficiency, right? But that's not always the best practice when we're looking at equity. And remember, equity is different than equality. And it asks us to say that in order for us to have equality, we have to understand that we have very different social equalities in place, and people all come from different starting points and lines and have different needs. And so sometimes something might look unfair because we're making different accommodations or giving something different to somebody, but sometimes we have to do that to have equity to move us towards equality, right? So it's a little abstract there, but it's really important for us to push ourselves individually and collectively to kind of move in that direction. All right, next slide.
So I think this was my slide.
Yeah.
Onboarding, and recruiting. We're gonna go through, you'll get a copy of these slides. I
will.
think in the interest of time, we can't go through all of this. We've talked about a lot of it.
Yes.
We have hopefully given you a bit of starting information, and you can reach out to us or reach out to Chris if there needs to be more explanation. So we'll go to the next slide. And, this is a conversation that we hope to have, but I don't think we have time for a bunch of comments. We have about 5 minutes left, but why don't we just open it up to a couple of general questions, either in the chat or out loud. We can do maybe 1 or 2 questions. I'm sure there's some that have been brewing out there. And we will, again, get you a copy of these slides. So anything else that needs more explanation or we need to go in depth on, we're happy to do that. The conversations have been so good, though, we didn't want to go away from them. So if anybody has anything that we haven't gotten to, please go ahead and either put it in the chat or raise your hand.
And this is a good question for you all to take back to your organization and have with your team, right? And then this was really, we put the Smarty in here. This is a really good approach that you all can explore as well. And if you want more on the Smarty, we have lots of resources to share. Any other questions that you all have? And thank you all for making this so engaging with the chat and talking and sharing examples. This has been fantastic. We're so grateful to have this space.
I thought I'd just share quickly on onboarding. I work for a very large company, like 8,000 employees internationally. And one of the things that we do is when you're hired here, you get a buddy. So your buddy's been around a while, you get to have the buddy. In the first week is you're just meeting everyone on your team. You're having, short conversations and getting in the really easing folks in. It can be extra scary in a big place. I know I've been in places, nonprofits, where I walk in and literally there's an office, you're sitting in it, and that's it. That was your onboarding. Figure it out from there. So it is really important to kind of think about how you bring folks along, and definitely how you bring folks along that have lived experience or might not naturally feel comfortable in the entire space. So we do try to think of that through our buddy system is what we call it.
Yeah.
And
I love that you bring that up. Can I share one really quick thing, Chris and Donald? So this is interesting, right? When we think about onboarding, I just want us to go also back to the bi-directional. So the person coming in needs that buddy, as Chris said. That's really important. But sometimes other folks may need buddies as well to come on board, right? So the example being, we have a organization in town, a nonprofit, and they really wanted to kind of focus on linguistic diversity based on the community's needs. So they brought in two people who are English language learners, right? And as an ESOL person myself, right, I can tell you, there are if you're not used to that and working, right, people have been very impatient sometimes in meetings or, not given time to process or share. And so there needs to be the buddies and mentoring around to help other people as well, so that inclusion can happen in many ways, right? So onboarding is a lot of different things. Donald, were you going to say something?
The only thing I was going to say is that this is another place, and we've done this in other workshops, is this is a place where your sphere of influence is important. So if you can reflect on your onboarding process, if there are blind spots there that you haven't, that weren't comfortable for you, this is a place where you can call out your organization or call in your organization and help them understand some of the challenges that you had, and maybe that'll help the next person. So everything we talk about, there's a sphere of influence where you can change the dynamic within your company, your community, or your country. And we're hoping that you exercise those spheres of influence in all of these places we've talked about.
Yeah.
Thank you, Donald, for those remarks, and thank you, Rajni, as well, and Kristen, for keeping everything going. We are at the top of our time. There is never enough time in 2 hours to talk through all of this, and this has been our 8th session in 8 weeks, in fact, that Racial Equity Partners has been able to produce for us. So just want to say a big old thank you to Donald, to Rajni, to the entire Racial Equity Partner team, and to you all for being here through this series. We are not done with racial equity. We are taking a couple-week break, but we're going to come back and do cultural humility. I believe we have a 3-session series with Rajni to talk through cultural humility and think through that. So do look for those, look for that on our website, and go ahead and sign up for those that make sense. I'm going to go ahead and close this up. I'm really just grateful for all of you being here with us, and thank you for attending this California Housing and Community Development Community Workshop offered through the Emergency Solutions Grant Coronavirus Relief Consulting and Staffing Services Contract. look out for more racial equity sessions. As I said, culture mobility is upcoming. We will have a 3-session survey that pops up when you leave the session. Do give us feedback. I did get some feedback from Alejandro during the session that I will incorporate, but we look at that every single week and we make adjustments. So if there's anything you want to see, any questions you have, please go ahead and put it in. We love seeing, hearing from you, whether it was just great job or if you have something that you'd like to see moving forward. With that, I will say, have a good rest of your Thursday and can't wait to see you in the next session. Be well.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Stay well.